Hello, friends. We welcome you to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Television. Chapters is the show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in the states of West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. I'm your host, Eliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. Joining us on this episode of Chapters is college professor and nonfiction author Matt Ferrence. We're talking to him today about his new book, Appalachia North, a Memoir. And Matt joins us today as a writer and a professor who lives and teaches in Northwest Pennsylvania. He's the chair of the English department at Allegheny College, which is located at the confluence of Appalachia and the Rust Belt. He's the author of the book American Redneck, Variations of an Icon from James Fenimore Cooper to the Dixie Chicks, which was published by the University of Tennessee Press in 2014 and was a finalist for the Weatherford Award. He's also the author of Appalachia North, which we'll be talking about a lot today, which came about after the diagnosis of a brain tumor, setting him on a journey that is part memoir, part exploration of geology and place. And we're delighted to have Matt with us here on the program today. So welcome to Chapters, Matt. Good to see you. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me down.
I wanted to ask you, there's so much about your book that I like and so much I wanted to get to, but I want to talk first just a little bit about Appalachia and kind of location and place is so important in your book. And a lot of people don't realize that Appalachia actually starts kind of at the southern part of New York and stretches all the way down into Mississippi and Arkansas and covers large swaths of the East Coast. But you write about kind of this idea of Pennsylvania and Pennsylvania being in Appalachia. And I wanted to ask you about a quote that James Carville made, a political commentator, and he's been on CNN, and someone asked him about Pennsylvania, and he said, well, there's Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and a lot of Alabama in between. So the part of the world in which you live and write and teach does fall into Appalachia, but I know that's a central part of kind of what you're writing about in Appalachia North. Can you talk a little bit about place and that part of this northern area of Appalachia?
Yeah. Well, so I think about that Carville quote a lot and all the different people who are insulted when he says that. And it includes me as being from the Alabama portion of Pennsylvania, but that also insults Alabama, and it's meant to sort of impugn the entire region of the South and Appalachia in one fell swoop. So for me, part of thinking about Pennsylvania as part of the region is to push back against the idea that that's a bad thing. And I learned this, I did graduate school at WVU, and one of the things I love about West Virginia is no one denies that they're Appalachian. And in Pennsylvania, very few people know they're Appalachian. And if we know it, we think we're Appalachian, which maybe we are. And so for me, it was that recognition that I had a cultural identity, and it was aligned with a broader group of people, and also was its own thing. And James Carville shouldn't be saying those things without understanding that we can take pride in where we're from also.
And I think so much of what you're getting at here in Appalachia is, yes, we are some of the things that the national media says we are in terms of a people, and yes, we have poverty, yes, we have people living in substandard housing, but there's also a richness to the land, to the people, to some of the cultural traditions that are a part of this region, and that seems to fuel a lot of what you're writing about too.
Right, and it's not just that. I think that's the important thing, is that you can look in a small aperture and you can look for that kind of Appalachia if you want to see it. But if you say that's all it is, that's never true. In the research for this book, I found an interesting article, and I can't remember the name of the author off the top of my head, but he said if you expanded the borders of the ARC just to include Cleveland and Cincinnati, the poverty rates of Appalachia would suddenly look like the rest of rural America. And so that what we think of Appalachia is false even by the way we draw the lines. So it's not untrue in that we do have the things and we need to work on those things, but we can't be defined solely by that. So we have to open up our identities to more things, including Northerners.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know one of the things that really was moving about your book is you write pretty openly and frankly about a health problem that you had, a health crisis, which was the diagnosis of a brain tumor and the surgery and the treatment that came about of that. And that kind of interweaves into what's going on in your memoir. How did that come about? How did you find out that you had this brain tumor, and what was that whole process like for you going through that, personally and physically and emotionally?
Yeah. So I discovered it in either a beautiful way or a terrible way, as I was reading to one of my sons at night when he was young, and I was reading Calvin and Hobbes to him, and I noticed that I could make Calvin's head disappear if I closed my right eye, which didn't seem like it should happen. And I had been asking optometrists about this for a couple of years, and finally I decided, because maybe this is Appalachian, we'd reached the high deductible on our okay health insurance, to go to an ophthalmologist, and within a week I knew I had a brain tumor and had to have surgery. So that's a shock. You're 40 years old or so, and you find out you've got something significant. Then for me, I think dealing with it, writing the book was part of dealing with it and recognizing it's not the same kind of problematic narrative, but there's a similar problematic narrative of health recovery with the region. And we're always talking about recovery in the region, or let's get back to what it once was. Those things aren't available. And for me, in my health, that's not available anymore. So I have to think about what I am moving forward as an eroded person, and that's how I use the metaphor of erosion throughout the memoir as a positive attribute of what makes us as Appalachians.
You mentioned your children too,
Right.
and I wanted to ask you a quote that caught my attention when I was reading your book. You said this about your children: "I fear they will find no home, no place to seep into their souls and settle their minds."
Yeah.
What did you mean about that quote, and are you connecting that specifically to their location now in kind of this northern Appalachian area, or maybe in a larger context?
Yeah, so I think first is the larger context. For me, being from southwestern Pennsylvania matters, and I feel deeply connected to the farm that I grew up on, to the eroded hills, former mountains, if we want to call them that, plateaus of western Pennsylvania, and I want my children to feel connected to a region in some way. Now, I love Scott Russell Sanders, and he talks about being able to place yourself and sort of grow roots into a region, and I think that's okay. As well, and that's part of, like, I have a little conflict with northwestern Pennsylvania, which feels a little bit less Appalachian in topography than what I'm used to, but I want the boys to feel love for a location, but I don't want them to have to feel guilty if they fall in love with a different location, and that strikes me as the doom either way of being Appalachian. You're supposed to want to leave, and if you do leave, then you're guilty for having gone. And so we need to open up that space. I mean, I think place matters to us, but what that place is maybe is more negotiable than we need to think.
Yeah, and I was, when I read that quote in that whole section of your book, I was thinking about kind of what you were saying there, that there is this need now with younger generation, kids your children's age, as they age, to leave Appalachia. But what's interesting too is you find a lot of people who have left have
Yeah.
plans on coming back,
Yeah.
or when the first opportunity arises, either through retirement or through a work change, if they can get transferred, they want to come back. So
Right.
that connection to Appalachia stretches and kind of evolves over time, which I
Yeah.
thought was really interesting.
Yeah, and that's what I'd love for us to change our relationship to the region so that people didn't have to leave. Because, I mean, there's a reason why young people are going away, is that there are real economic problems, and they have to seek fortune somewhere else. And so if we can change our relationship to the landscape itself, maybe we can keep that connection. The rubber band doesn't have to get maybe so stretched. We can stay closer to home all the time.
There's a couple of themes that pop up in your story or in your memoir that I really found interesting. And you kind of talk about, to understand Appalachia, even Appalachia North, or really any of Appalachia, that we have to look at the history,
Yeah.
we have to look at kind of its contradictions, and also the repeated attempts to redefine itself. Can you talk a little bit about those themes and how those come to play in your story?
Yeah. So part of it is, I think, that Appalachia is a thing, and there is a real thing that it is. And to me, that's related to the geology and the rocks. There is a mountain range, and there are people who have grown up in that mountain range, and that's the stable thing. But around that have been all these historical moments of people coming into the region and telling us who we are. And usually that is still related to our geology, and it's usually about us digging it out in some way. And that's what I'd like to see changed. And we have to recognize that there have been strategies throughout history of making us less so that people who aren't from here can exploit what is here. Mm-hmm. And we put up with it because we have to, I think, in some ways, and we love where we're from. If we can recognize that those aren't stable definitions, we can write the new ones. And I think, we see that in politics. This was some of what I wrote about in that first book. It was more of a scholarly book. The politics have done a good job of creating that linkage that usually leaves the people from Appalachia out of the equation.
That was going to be my next
Okay,
question,
yeah.
is how much do politics and our politicians play into this idea of what makes Appalachians so unique, but also what creates some of the problems that plague the region?
Yeah. So and I think of the problems a lot, and it's that whether they know it or not, and I think often they do know it, they reiterate the stereotypes as a way to continually be reelected. And I think about sort of a scarcity economy, and how if you maintain a scarcity economy and you keep the people always needing more, then it's easier to have political enemies that you can run against in some ways. One of the moments that opened my thinking a little bit here is the top 3 counties in Ohio, which at the lake is Ashtabula, Trumbull County, and Columbiana. I might be leaving one of them out there because there might be 4. Didn't join Appalachia until 2008, which struck me initially as ridiculous. And I think of it now as both ridiculous and opportunity. And they joined because those counties recognized that they were poor and they had access to ARC federal matching funds if they could join the region. But if we can think of politics as having that sort of mutability of borders, maybe we can fight back with a different mutability to say that, well, maybe we don't want to define ourselves just through poverty, and we're not going to use your convenient political definitions. We'll come up with our own.
You mentioned the term or the acronym ARC.
Yeah.
What does that stand for, and what is that?
So that's the Appalachian Regional Commission. It's in 1965. It was ultimately Johnson, but it began with JFK, the War on Poverty. And so they officially designated through the 13 states the counties that belonged to congressionally defined Appalachia. And that's the map that we're used to looking at now. That includes what had always, I think, been thought of as Appalachia, the Southern Highlands, and then on through Pennsylvania and the southern tier of New York, and then parts of Appalachian Ohio as well. And so that opens up federal development funds as one of its primary things. And it's been a very successful program, really. But it also keeps reiterating the stereotypes of our decline so that it can make sense of itself.
Yeah, kind of a real catch-22
It
in
is,
that
right.
regard. Yeah. I want to go back to your first book for a minute, which I love the title, All American Redneck, Variations of an Icon, from James Fenimore Cooper to the Dixie Chicks, which covers a lot of history and a lot of people. Tell us a little bit about that book. You mentioned it had a more of a scholarly tone or approach to it.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about what's going on in that book or what's happening there.
So that was a book where I had a neighbor who introduced me to the Blue Collar Comedy Tour, and I had not heard of them before, and I was kind of appalled when I first saw it in the way that it was Larry the Cable Guy, really, and what Larry the Cable Guy was doing with this sort of hillbilly image. And so I started thinking about where did that come from in American literary history. So I decided to trace back the literary redneck, and I located the beginning with Natty Bumppo in James Fenimore Cooper, who was this liminal figure who was a white man, but also sort of, he was hanging out with the Indians a lot, and it was frontier. And then thinking about how America itself has defined portions of America through the frontier that has been Appalachia and the mountains, and always creating a limitation. So Natty Bumppo could never be fully American because he also would side with the natives in the area. And the Dixie Chicks were fully country music and fully middle America until they criticized George Bush, and then they got thrown out. And so I was looking at all these different ways through literature we can see a very narrow band of definition in characters that then has real impact on the way we live our lives and the politics that see us in the same way.
So that book came out, University of Tennessee Press, 2014. Your new book that we've been talking about here came out February 1st of 2018, or 2019, excuse me. So at what point after the All-American Redneck book came out did you start thinking about and wanting to write this book, Appalachian North?
So I think even before the first book was out, I was really thinking about this book. I didn't know that it was this book yet. But there was one moment when I had gotten readers' reports for the first book, and I said, well, what if I rewrote it as a memoir? And the Tennessee Press was not interested in that at that point. It was a scholarly project. And so Appalachian North was hanging out in the back of my mind for all those years. And I had been working on a different project of essays that were related to my father was an environmental biologist, and I was rewriting his lab manual as personal essays about growing up on the farm in northern Appalachia. And then this book sort of presented itself as an opportunity with West Virginia to sort of connect to the idea of northern Appalachia, and then I had this brain tumor to write about. And suddenly I realized, well, this is rewriting that first book, but as a memoir instead of scholarly.
So we've seen so many books come out here recently. I don't want to say in response to, but kind of challenging what was published by J.D. Vance a couple of years ago in Hillbilly Elegy. Do you feel like your book fits into that discussion of a response or a commentary, or giving us another perspective that maybe Vance didn't connect with or write about as much as maybe he should have when it comes to profiling Appalachia?
I think definitely, and I take him on a bit directly at one point in the book, but for me, the critique of Hillbilly Elegy is it should have been a book like mine. It's a terrible critique, but it was somebody who was writing from a different kind of Appalachia. I mean, he was not even from the region, from around Cincinnati. I mean, he did spend time in it, but he had the opportunity to write about nuance and something that's not a familiar story. But instead, he chose to write the same story we've seen for 150 years about Appalachia. If there's a protest in my book to that, it's to suggest that we don't have to keep telling the same story over and over again, particularly when that story doesn't work out for us. And it's not really real. Now, the experiences Vance had may be real to him, but his connections and reflections to them aren't authentic. They seem to be prepackaged and pre-delivered. So I'd like to see more books, and I think there's been a lot that have come out since then that say, well, look, I've got a particular experience that's not what you think, and here's my story of being Appalachian. The more of those we see, the more we get to see the complexity of the region, and that gives us hope, I think, in some way.
Yeah.
I think books matter.
Oh, absolutely. And I want to ask you, too, about writing about Appalachia. When I think about all the Appalachian books I've read, and there's college courses on Appalachian fiction and literature, and we have seminars, and people can get doctorate degrees with that specialization, I kind of compare it to the Civil War. You know, I hear a lot of people say, well, when are we going to be able to stop writing about the Civil War? Well, there's always so many new storylines and things to write about. Yeah. And I feel that way about Appalachia. I feel like there's so many different aspects of culture and people and place that can be written about on Appalachia. Do you feel like that is that's a subject that you can write about more, or that scholars and writers or anybody that wants to kind of set a book around that umbrella will have plenty to write about?
I think absolutely. And for me, part of that is this idea that we imagine, or we're taught to imagine, that there are really stable borders around what Appalachia means literally and figuratively, and they don't exist. They're always up for consideration, and that's why we can keep writing new stories. And so we're going to rewrite those lines consistently in our heads and in our stories. And we'll always be from here, and so we always have stories to tell about what that really means.
I wanted to ask you about another image you write about in your book, which I thought was really interesting, and this was a pickup truck you once owned. And you wrote that it was an antidote to middle American respectability. What did you mean by that? Because I love that line. I kind of wrote LOL by that quote because that really got my attention. But what did you mean by that about your pickup truck?
My now almost 10-year-old still is a little angry with me that I got rid of that truck, and I'm still a little angry with myself too. I think it had to do with so being in academia. I've heard things, people that I like have said to me, oh, you can't be from Appalachia, you don't have an accent. Or others will say, well, you're not a real Appalachian, you're from Pennsylvania. And this always galled me because, like, again, these were these hard lines of, well, you need to have a Southern accent. Or I think they were all trying to say, you should be dumber. So they were insulting my region and the whole region, and actually their home, too, because they live in Appalachia. And so part of the truck for me, I think, was to say, I drive a truck and you don't. And that's okay. And I mean, it's sort of a silly protest in some ways, but I think that matters, that there's something cultural about that. I mean, I grew up driving trucks too on the farm, but part of it was a little bit of a, at those people who would say, you're not a real hillbilly. I'm like, oh, yeah, I do drive a truck, don't I?
So that gives you one label, one symbol,
check.
one check mark on the list. That's excellent.
And I was in 4-H, so I got two.
You got two. That's great. There's something else, another kind of characteristic, or I don't want to say an animal, but going back to your brain tumor cancer scare, you write about, and you kind of funnel this around, treatment and the diagnosis of your brain tumor to the emergence of cicadas, which some of us remember a number of years ago. They came out of the ground and made a big mess, and then hibernating again, and we're probably due here pretty soon for them to come back. But tell us a little bit about the interplay that going on there between the cicadas and how that revelation and their presence kind of tied into your brain tumor descriptions.
So I'm always interested in the biome that we live in addition to the rocks that we live in. And cicadas, and the periodic cicada in particular, are not unique to Appalachia, but are almost unique to Appalachia. So they're from the eastern United States. And there's something in their behavior that the cyclical nature of it is fascinating. And then also their appearance versus their reality. And so their appearance is kind of terrifying and end of the world like, because there's so many of these bodies flying around, and then the bodies are dying, and as I write about in the book, you're squishing them and there's the smell of rot and decay. But at the same time, there's a hope in this cycle, is that they're blooming and they've been waiting underground to be released. So as an image or metaphor, for me, this is a recalibration of how we can think about shock. And so the shock of a brain tumor, which I think you always will live with, but you could just be shocked with the potential decay and death, or you can start to use it as a way to think about what cycles of bloom maybe exist in you as well. So that's sort of how I started to see, because they're cool bugs, really. They're really quite amazing, and terrifying, but not.
Yeah. It's terrifying in their size, kind of their color, and the red eyes that they have, but basically harmless.
And the rattle, and they don't even hurt the trees that they're sucking juices off of. There's a lot of them. And actually their emergence in volume keeps them safe as a species. So the fact that they're scary is actually what makes them live. So
yeah, absolutely.
In some ways, does a brain tumor make me live? Maybe. It's a sign of life in some way. I'm still here.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good. Who are some writers, Matt, that influence you?
Yeah, so I have kind of a holy triumvirate of nonfiction writers, and St. Scott Russell Sanders, St. Annie Dillard, who doesn't get credit as an Appalachian writer, but she's from Pittsburgh, so she should count, and Brenda Miller. So I'm deeply influenced as an essayist by those three, plus Brian Doyle, whose prose is so beautiful, and then also, unfortunately, he died of a brain tumor about a year and a half ago. Then on the fiction side, really Brees Pancake. I came to him late, again, at West Virginia, and it just opened me up to thinking about how you could write really serious fiction that's so fully embedded in place. And I don't know that there's any of him in my writing, probably not, but I'd like to imagine there's a little flicker moving through.
So what is your writing process like? When you get an idea, you started thinking about writing Appalachian North.
Yeah.
How did you start putting that together? What was the drafting process, revision process like? How did you work through the various stages of writing the book?
Yeah, so my process is fairly chaotic in that I write in these little chunks, and so sort of fragment chunks, almost like you would be writing a collage essay. And normally my experience is I write a chunk, I'm like, well, the chunk's okay, but I don't know what it means. Then I write another chunk, I'm like, well, that chunk's okay, I don't know what it means, and certainly together they don't mean anything. And I'll do that, and I'll have 15 or 20 of these, and I'm about ready to quit. And then I write another chunk, and suddenly I see the connections that I realize that the cicada has something to do with the brain tumor. So that's sort of how I work through it, thinking of the narrative story and trying to write from the lyric out. For this book, I had to start folding the informational on top of that. So I began really with the lyric and the story of recovery and thinking, what do people need to know? And I credit the editors at WVU Press for helping with this. What do people need to know about Appalachia that I know but they don't? And that became another chunk or fragment that layered on top of it.
Very good.
So I think of it maybe as tectonic plates or layers
almost
of
like
mountain.
a scaffolding approach,
Yeah.
sort of. Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
What is a challenge, or maybe for you, or maybe a universal challenge in writing memoir, do you think?
Well, one is that I think at heart no one cares about anyone else's story. And I say that a bit tongue-in-cheek, but that there's nothing particularly exciting about my life. I won the memoir sweepstakes by having a serious health crisis, because that's the sort of things people look for in memoir. But even that doesn't have a lot of meaning until you make meaning of it. So for me, the challenge of memoir, and this is what I'm always teaching my students, is the meaning we make out of the experiences we've had. And that's the hard intellectual labor of it. Let me tell you a story about a fox I see or a cicada that I've seen, and what does it really mean if I connect it? That's the challenge I love about the memoir. For me, that creates connections that I would not have made if I wasn't doing the writing. And again, if I just told you my life story, wrote my autobiography, it's really not that interesting. I hope it becomes more interesting when we start using metaphor, we start using reflection and making sense of it, so you can see your life and my life is kind of the goal.
Very good. So what is Matt Ference working on next?
That's a hard question. I was joking. I write a lot of memos these days since I have a semi-bureaucratic position. But there's two projects I've been toying with. One is some kind of Appalachian, Northern Appalachian fiction I have a short story that I've written, which is either the beginning of a collection of short stories about a fictional town in northern Appalachia, or the beginning of a novel that may or may not be full of magical creatures. I'm not sure. The other one is not Appalachian, but maybe is. It would be a literary biography of the French saxophonist Marcel Mule. And that's part of what I want to open that space to, is that we can be Appalachian writers even when we're not writing about the things we're supposed to. And I grew up playing the saxophone. It was supposed to be the career I had, and Marcel Mule's an interesting figure, so I might write that.
Do you wonder about that book and somebody saying, well, why is an Appalachian writing about Marcel Mule?
Yeah, I do, and I hope no one else struggles with this like I do, and part of me feels like, oh, I shouldn't write it then, because that's not what's expected of me, and I have to tell myself, no, it's okay, we can write about the things we are. Like, I learned who Marcel Mule was in Appalachia, so there's nothing about a French saxophonist from the 1940s that isn't Appalachian. So maybe that's the book I need to write.
Very good. So Matt, in our final moments with you today, if anyone wants to get in contact with you to talk to you about your books, or to talk to you about writing, or just get in contact with you, how can they get in contact with you, and then where can they get copies of Appalachian North?
So you should be able to get copies of the book from your local bookstore or any of those magical online places. I have a website, MatthewFerence.com, Appalachia on Instagram, and @MJFerence on Twitter. And I like talking to people any way they want to get in touch with me that way.
Great. Matt Ferrence has been our guest here today on Chapters. He's the chair of the English department at Allegheny College, and also the author of 2 books, American Redneck, Variations on an Icon from James Fenimore Cooper to the Dixie Chicks, and his latest memoir, which came out in February 1st, or on February 1st in 2019, Appalachian North. Matt, it was great to have you here on Chapters today. Thanks so much for coming on, and congratulations on your new book. It's really terrific.
Thank
Congratulations.
you. Thanks.
We also want to take a moment to say thanks to the staff and management of the Inner Geek for providing our on-site support and assistance today. We encourage you to come down to the Inner Geek and inquire about Matt Ference's books, and remind you that many of the other authors, editors, and publishers featured on our program have their works for sale right here at the Inner Geek. So come on down to Pullman Square in downtown Huntington and get any reading taste satisfied that you have right here at the Inner Geek, and we appreciate their sponsorship and support each and every episode here on Chapters. And if you'd like to stay in contact with us here on the program, we've made a variety of ways for you to be able to do that, mainly through social media platforms. The first way you can stay in contact with us and give us questions, comments, or feedback about this program or any program that you've seen is through the email address that's right here at the bottom of the screen, lp4@zoominternet.net. We do ask that you please include your name and the town or city in which you're writing from so that we can keep track of that correspondence. If you're a viewer of YouTube, we have a Chapters page through the Armstrong one-wire link on YouTube, and that address is right here at the bottom of the screen. There, when you click on the Chapters tab, you can find all of our author, editor, and publisher interviews archived there as well. And we also have a Facebook page, and that address is here at the bottom of the screen. What you'll find on our Facebook page is our more recent interviews archived there. You can comment on those programs, share and repost those to your Facebook page or any other social media platform you have linked through Facebook. So if you like Facebook, YouTube, or email, we've made it possible for you to stay in contact with the program. We appreciate all the comments and feedback we receive, and we appreciate those of you sharing our programs and our interviews through YouTube and Facebook. We appreciate that so very much. And that will do it for us this time on Chapters, but please come again next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.